Hi, I'm Marek with the Center for European Studies at Carleton University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Collyer. He is a senior lecturer in geography at the University of Sussex, and he's here at Carleton University today to participate in a policy workshop on European Union migration policy. So thank you for joining me today, Dr. Collyer.
Thank you.
Your talk discussed sort of new trends in migration in the southern neighborhood of the EU. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on some of these trends.
The trends that I was talking about in my speech earlier today were focused on three countries where I've done a little research recently. One in Morocco, where they've recently started a regularization program for undocumented migrants that appears to be a very positive development. The second research around the Libya crisis of 2011, where just over 1 million people went to Tunisia in the months after the beginnings of the crisis in March 2011. And about 250,000 eventually made their way to a refugee camp, Shusha camp in the south of Tunisia. And last July 2013, they closed this camp eventually after about 2 years. And most people had either returned home or been resettled, but there was a group of about 250 who were left that were unwilling to return home, and the UNHCR had not found them to qualify for refugee resettlement. So in the end, the Tunisian government accepted them. And the third situation, perhaps the most concerning one at the moment in relation to the European Union, is the tremendous exodus from Syria. Currently about 2.4 million refugees are recognised by UNHCR in neighbouring countries, and there's another 1.5 million or so individuals displaced within Syria. And the European Union has responded in fairly hesitant ways so far, given the size of the crisis and how close the crisis is to the European Union. There's been a lot of hope that there might be a declaration that Syrians would be protected through some sort of temporary protection regime, as was the case in the 90s with Bosnians, but so far that hasn't been forthcoming, and I don't think it's likely to at the moment.
The theme, I guess, or the central topic of the seminar here today has been the challenge of balancing security and humanitarianism in migration policy. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where the EU as a whole stands on this sort of issue.
The security focus is a dominant concern of European Union states, and a humanitarian rhetoric has been more and more visible over the last few years. Some people would criticize this and say that it's fairly sort of superficial window dressing for some of this security discussion. Others would see the humanitarian developments as positive indications of a gradual appreciation of human rights amongst EU institutions. And I think it's difficult to point to any clear evidence either way. The example that I started with, and many other people referred to this incident as well, is the October the 3rd tragedy just off Lampedusa, where 155 survivors were prosecuted the following day under a 2009 Italian law which criminalizes illegal entry. And what are now 366 confirmed fatalities, there were 366 bodies recovered now, were granted posthumous Italian citizenship and initially offered a state funeral. So the discrepancy between the response to the survivors of incarceration and prosecution and the fatalities of posthumous Italian citizenship and general recognition by the Italian state, a day of mourning called in Italy, which I think is genuine. I mean, I don't think it would be a particularly cynical response which suggested that this was some kind of instrumentalization of this tragedy. I think there was a genuine outpouring of grief in Italy for this terrible tragedy, even though it's clearly not the first time or sadly the last that it's happened. But I think this difficulty of balancing security and humanitarianism is effectively summed up in the Italian response to this case of a fairly schizophrenic response of focusing on security on the one hand but aware of the humanitarian context of the tragedy on the other hand, and clearly not reconciling the two, I think, in this case.
So what can we learn about the EU's approach to migration and asylum policy from incidents like the Lampedusa incident and ongoing really tragedies in the Mediterranean like it, as well as the Arab Spring and the Syrian crisis ongoing as well?
The initial response in all of these cases has been to reinforce border controls, and second, in certain situations, to consider more humanitarian involvement. So the automatic response from European Union institutions seems to continue to focus on this security element of this balance, despite very substantial civil society efforts to try to shift this balance. I think one of the impacts of the political changes across North Africa have been a greater level of democracy, and European Union engagement with the region before 2011 really depended on a lack of democracy. It depended on having a relative, more or less totalitarian regime at stake who was prepared to put their own interests ahead of the population. And Ben Ali in Tunisia is the classic example, where very repressive measures against the Tunisian population prevented them leaving. Very anti-democratic measures, since most of them wanted greater opportunity to move around. And removing that totalitarian element led to a lot of concern within the European Union institutions that without that potential for repressive control, the mobility of individuals from North Africa and through North Africa was going to increase quite substantially. So very soon after these political changes, governments such as the Italian government began negotiating with new governments in Tunisia or Libya in particular, in order to try to reinstate the kind of control that they had depended on from previous regimes. And in some contexts that control is not forthcoming, or the willingness to engage in that sort of political repression which is necessary to stop the emigration of entire populations. And it's been difficult to negotiate. And the Moroccan situation, I think, offers an example of a government which has become significantly more democratic over the last few years, significantly more in touch with and responsive to the desires of the Moroccan population. And that has resulted in much greater flexibility around movement, the regularization that I mentioned earlier in Morocco, offering residency status to what's estimated to be between 25,000 and 40,000 undocumented migrants currently in Morocco, which will enable them a much more secure existence within Morocco, and for those who want it, much greater possibility to leave Morocco when they want to. So the previous outright repression of undocumented migration in Morocco, which the European Union institutions relied on to a greater or lesser extent, is no longer so forthcoming. And I think EU policy in the region now has to respond.
What's the impact of the EU's externalization of migration and asylum policies to third countries, particularly in North Africa?
The impact, I think, has changed in recent years with these political changes in North Africa. Previously, as I said, externalization processes focused very much on the repression that certain regimes were able to exert over entire populations. And with the removal of those regimes, the possibilities for that repression have become significantly less. That externalization has moved significantly beyond North Africa, into Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia. There are significant engagements with governments down the west coast of Africa. And further afield than that, the Sri Lankan government, for example, has signed various agreements with the European Union in order to both facilitate migration from Sri Lanka and also engage in various control practices. So one of the responses to this gradual political liberalisation or increase in democracy from regimes across North Africa has been to further establish controls and connections with governments beyond that, so a pushing out of this externalisation. There's also been a gradual development of a more internal level of control, and certainly in my own country, in the UK, the recent attempts to develop legislation. There's a current immigration bill in examination by the government at the moment, which will restrict access of undocumented migrants to a whole range of services and public benefits within the UK. So given the greater difficulties of engagement with regimes who are no longer as willing as they were across North Africa to support the sort of control policies that the European Union wants to engage in certain places like the UK, there is greater emphasis on internal control policies at access to these key public resources. There's also a shift in technological emphasis to look at a greater emphasis on biometrics, for example, the development of databases like Eurodac, which attempt to develop technological solutions to some of these issues. The development of smart borders is usually one of the terms that summarizes a lot of these biometric controls, emphasis on particular technologies at borders themselves, like heat-seeking or thermal imaging, and the development of extensive databases that operate increasingly on a global scale to provide data and advanced passenger information to people who are potentially reaching the European Union. So there's a range of other responses in addition to externalisation, I think.
Canadian policymakers recently have looked to Europe to provide new and often more restrictive approaches to migration and asylum policies. I'm just wondering what your opinion is of these recent developments in Canadian policymaking in these areas.
The Canadian government has recently introduced an assisted voluntary return program, very much modelled on the system that has been operating for some time across the European Union. And it will be interesting to see the extent to which this follows the details of European systems. And the European systems are typically managed by the International Organization for Migration. They are focused on individuals who, in most cases, have no real alternative to returning, individuals who are irregularly resident, who are within the asylum system at the moment or have been recently rejected from the asylum system, rather than individuals who have some sort of secure residency or secure status within the European Union. So there's some concern about the nature of the voluntariness of that return, given that individuals don't really have much alternative. There's also concern about the nature of return in that context, given that many individuals are returning or being returned to countries which continue to be affected by conflict, like Iraq or the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in some cases it is very difficult for them to return to their actual homes. Individuals are returned to their country of origin, but not really their region or their town or their village of origin. So the nature of return in some of the EU sponsored schemes is problematic. And it will be interesting to see if that again is mimicked by the Canadian uptake of this. So I think the nature of policy learning, and it's interesting that these particular policy instruments have been taken up by the Canadian government, and it will be interesting to see the extent to which they are developed into a more Canadian solution, or if they are copied wholesale, including these various problems that have been widely commented on in Europe, I think. I would hope that the Canadian government, which is seen as having a much more positive record on fulfilling human rights obligations in international migration regimes than most EU governments, I think, EU member state governments. I would hope that they would be able to recognise some of the difficulties in applying these sorts of policy instruments and rectify some of the potential problems in relation to human rights.